But as parents, you never expect in your wildest dreams to ever lose a child. Let me just start from the beginning. After we had Harrison, Paul and I talked about having our second child, and at that time we really didn't care what God was going to give us as long as it was a healthy child. And but a little bit of part of me wanted a little girl and was kind of praying for a little girl, and so we ended up pregnant, and we didn't really have to try very hard. It was just kind of a little miracle that she came along. So with the second ultrasound, we were able to figure out the sex of the baby, and I'll never forget them saying, "Would you like to know what the sex of the baby is?" And of course, we're all looking at each other and saying, "Yes, we do." And when they announced that it was a little girl, of course, you can imagine how we felt. And the first year of her life with us was, I'm going to say, magical. Like I said, we had Harrison, and he brought so much joy to us. And then Caroline came along, and we had our boy, and we had our little girl, and we just really thought that we had a perfect little family. And we thought we were done at this point. Come to find out a little bit later that there's really no such thing as a perfect little family. The first year of her life, she had no indications of any problems with anything, sickness. She was always a well child, and as Harrison was too. And so there was just no red alerts, there until she reached about 18 months old. And so that was when our light turned to darkness, was on that day. The first one was whenever she's about 18 months old, and that's when I had called Paul from Doodlebugs, and I said, "I'm taking our daughter to the ER. You and Harrison need to meet me there. She's very lethargic." She had taken a nap in her pack and play. I always kept one in the back of the store, and she always took like a 30-minute little cat nap. And for some odd reason that day, and you'll see a picture of her where she looked healthy and fine. I took it right before I laid her down, and she was wide awake, but though she couldn't move. And so that's whenever everything started. And so they met me there. And of course, in the back of my mind, diabetes runs in my side of the family. And I always remember Caroline having to drink a lot. She always had her sippy cup. And so diabetics like to drink a lot. So as a mom, I'm already trying to diagnose her as I'm heading to the ER, and they're trying to meet me. And I'm thinking that maybe her blood sugar dropped and just bottomed out, and that's why she's lethargic. So by the time we got there and I had a limp baby in my hands, they basically said, "Fill out these papers and have a seat." And so we filled out the papers, and I kept telling them, you need to see her now. But the ER was just filled with so many patients at that time. And by the time they got there, and Harrison went and got some juice out of the vending machine, I said, "Go get her some juice and bring it to Mama." So he did, and we started giving her a little bit of juice because, again, I'm thinking diabetes. And so she started drinking that, and by the time they called for us to go to the back to see any physician, she had already come to, and so she just looked normal at this point.
And
so they never witnessed.
Yeah. But to answer your question, just two. There was one that at the end of that summer, and then one near Christmas.
Right before Christmas.
So.
But she was, like he said, that one episode we did have to contact LifeNet ambulance service here in Hot Springs. And while the EMTs were coming, we were explaining the blank look that she had on her face whenever she tripped and fell right before Christmas. And I remember asking Harrison, did she trip over a toy, or was there a shoe that was left on the floor? Why is she so upset? So I went over there and grabbed her. And you know how a mother would always try to console their child. And, you know, I was saying, Caroline, are you okay? Are you okay? And then all of a sudden I pulled her back and her face was facing mine. And that's when I yelled for him, you know, I need help. And so we dialed the LifeNet ambulance service, and she just had this blank look on her face. And it was like she was physically there, but it was like she couldn't hear you. And as he spoke earlier, that's when her little eyes kind of looked up at the ceiling. And so he immediately grabbed her, and he was fixing to start CPR on her while LifeNet was coming. And we were trying to protect Harrison because he was so young at the time, and we were telling him to go downstairs. We didn't want him to witness, you know, what was happening, because as parents, we didn't know really what was going on at the time. And like he said, that's whenever the only thing that brought her back to us, right before the EMTs knocked on the door, was that she just projectile vomited. And she came to, and I just remember, you know, her gnawing, kind of like sucking like a pacifier just right here on her little fist. And
So there was like a lot of signs between, like, even though the one period that she did have that, you know, they were talking about petit mal seizures and stuff like that, where infants get febrile seizures. But she had no fever, you know, so nothing was matching up. And basically when we did take her to the ER, we were kind of blown off.
Yeah, I was told I was an overreactive mother to my face.
She had come back around and was fussy, and wouldn't let the doctor check her, you know. And he was like, I'll tell you what, I'll write this prescription, and if she doesn't get better, just start her on this, and if she does, you know, great. And a week or two later, she was gone.
So.
One of her characteristics was independence, and like we said earlier, and she didn't want to be held, but that night, like I said, we were getting ready for the ball, so Catherine had to go out and have her nails done and stuff, her hair, whatever. And so I had to babysit, you know, and Caroline came up to me and literally, like, wouldn't let me put her down. I mean, I held her and held her and held her. Catherine called and asked how she was doing, and she was on my hip as I was standing, you know. And I was like, she won't let me put her down. And so finally, because I had to, I mean, I probably held her for a good hour and a half. I put her down, and I sat in one of my chairs, and she went and got, I think to her, she was probably telling me goodbye, you know, wanted to spend that extra minute or two. She picked out a housing book with housing plans and brought that to me and sat right next to me and climbed up, you know, right next to me, and just would point at the book, and she would make me flip the page. I was like, what are you doing? You know, I mean, so it went from like, you know, where is she, to, you know, her not letting me, like, out of her sight. And that was probably the most time we spent together in her entire 2 years, was that final night. So
It's almost like she knew.
yeah, I think she did, you know, really.
Ironically, Paul and I were the event chairs for the American Heart Association. And the heart ball was supposed to be that weekend that she passed. And so with that being said, I remember being on the phone that Valentine's Day, like the very next day, and it was the 15th, and just trying to tie up loose ends and trying to get the heart ball where it needs to be, you know, leading up. It's a huge event. And I remember Caroline clearly coming down the hall to my bedroom, and I was on the phone, and she would say, my bed, and she would point down the hall. And I would say, well, I will take you in just a moment, sweetie. I know it's getting late. Let Mama wrap this up, and I'll put you to bed. And she goes, no, Mama, my bed. And she just kept pointing to her bed. And she was a little girl that loved her nursery. She played in her room. She played with her baby dolls. And she loved her bed. And so I remember putting her in her bed. This was February 15th. And we always leaned over into the crib, and I would say the prayer. And we would allow her, we were trying to wean her off her passy, and we would only allow her to have it at night. So she had that passy in her mouth, and so I would say the prayer. And the only thing she would say at the end was, Amen. Amen. But she would pop that passy right back in her mouth. And I told her, the last thing I remember is sweet dreams. And she was not sick. She was not running fever. She had been playing. She had on her American Girl little purple gown that matched her baby doll's little gown that night. And when I left the crib and walked halfway to the door, I do recall getting a sense of, if you ever have anybody like walk up behind you and like you really want to turn around but you're not quite sure. So I stopped in the middle of the floor before I hit the door, and it was like there was a presence and that I felt. And I remember saying, oh, she loves her bed, to myself. She's okay. And then I started hearing her kind of jibber jabber, and she wasn't crying or anything like that. It sounded happy. And so,
monitor.
yes. And so I ran down the hall, and Paul goes, and I was laughing, and Paul was like, what are you doing? I said, turn up the baby monitor. And we had it in the room. And so Paul reaches over and returns. I said, listen, just listen. And so she was in there just gibbering, just in a language.
She could talk.
And she could talk where we could understand her, when she was with us. But it was almost a different language. And she would, and it sounded like a question, like she was asking a question. And I remember looking at him going, what is she saying?
Yeah.
And there was no crying. And the next thing we know, we could hear her resting, and we could hear her breathing on the baby monitor. And I remember you saying that, silly girl, like that. And so it was like that was the last night that we really have slept in many years, like a sound sleep. I don't know if that was God's way of trying to protect us of what was, about to happen the next morning. The next morning was...
It was almost like we
were... life is never the same, but it keeps going on whether you want it to or not.